Hey there and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into The Lean Startup by Eric Ries.
Great book.
It is. Now I know what you're thinking, isn't that like just for tech companies? But trust me on this.
Oh, yeah.
The principles in this book can be applied to really any business idea you've got.
Okay.
And it might just be the secret weapon that you need to avoid becoming another statistic in the 90% of startups that, unfortunately end up failing.
Yeah, well, that's right. The lean startup framework is all about how to minimize your risk
Yeah.
and waste. It's really a good way to test your assumptions before you invest a ton of time and a ton of money.
Okay, so let's break down what lean startup actually means, though. We're not talking about cutting corners here or being cheap, are we?
Not at all. It's about being smart
Yeah.
and efficient. It's about validating demand for your product or your service before you go all in. Think of it like building a house.
Okay.
You wouldn't start with the roof, would you?
Definitely not. You got to make sure you have a solid foundation first. So in the lean startup world, what's the foundation?
Well, it all starts with the build, measure, learn loop. This
Right.
is really the core of the
Okay.
lean startup approach, and it's a continuous cycle. So you build a minimum viable product,
Okay.
you measure how customers react to it,
Right.
and then you learn from that feedback to iterate and improve.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Let's dig into this MVP thing. I keep hearing that term thrown around.
Yeah.
But what does a good MVP actually look like?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting because it can take many forms. The key is to figure out the most basic version of your product that allows you to test your core assumptions.
So it's not about launching a perfect, fully featured product right away.
Exactly. Think about Dropbox. Their MVP wasn't the complex file sharing software we know today. It was a simple explainer video.
Wow.
They wanted to test if people would even be interested in this whole concept of
Yeah.
effortless file syncing.
Hold on. They launched with just a video, no software at all.
Not at first. That video was brilliant because it allowed them to gauge interest and gather valuable feedback before they even wrote a single line of code.
Smart.
And the response, huge.
Wow. I never knew that.
Yeah.
It makes you realize even the simplest MVP can be incredibly powerful. So once you've got your MVP out there, what's next?
Then comes the measure phase,
Okay.
where you collect real customer feedback. This isn't about guessing or relying on your gut feeling. It's about gathering data to see how people are actually using your product.
Right. And that's where things like user surveys, website analytics, and even just talking to your early customers come into play, right?
Exactly.
But how did a company like Airbnb with such a unique concept go about measuring their idea in the early days?
They took the MVP concept quite literally.
Okay.
Before they were this global platform, the founders were just three guys with an air mattress in their San Francisco apartment.
Wow.
They wanted to test if people would actually pay to stay in someone's home, so they listed their air mattress online as a cheap alternative to a hotel room during a design conference.
Wait, so they basically started as an air mattress B&B?
That's right.
That's pretty gutsy, but it clearly paid off.
Hmm.
I'm starting to see how this measure phase really forces you to get out of your own head and see what's actually happening in the real world.
Absolutely. And based on what you learn in this phase,
Yeah.
you move to learn,
Okay.
where you use the data to iterate on your product. This might involve making small tweaks, or if you discover your initial assumptions were way off, you might have to make a major change, what Ries calls a pivot.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. We all know the success story of Instagram, but
Yeah.
did you know they started as a completely different app called Bourbon?
Oh yeah, Bourbon was a check-in app, kind of like Foursquare.
Yeah.
But the founders noticed that users were just going crazy for the photo sharing feature.
Really?
So they made this bold decision to pivot, focusing entirely on photos, and bam, Instagram was born.
I love that story. It shows how being willing to adapt based on customer feedback can lead to massive success. Okay, we've covered the build, measure, learn loop, but I'm curious, what are some of the biggest mistakes that startups make that this framework helps to avoid?
I think one of the biggest is building without testing.
Right.
So many startups pour years and resources into developing this product without ever really validating if there's a market for it.
Yeah.
They're so focused on their vision, that they kind of forget to ask if anyone else actually shares that vision.
Yeah, it's like they build it and they just assume the customers will come.
Exactly.
I can see how that'd be a recipe for disaster, especially in the fast-paced, startup world.
It is, and that's where the lean startup methodology really emphasizes getting that early feedback with an MVP. It's about minimizing risk by testing your assumptions before you go all in on development.
So it's about validating demand before you invest heavily.
Mm.
What else trips up startups?
Another common mistake is ignoring customer feedback. It's easy to become so attached to your initial idea that you dismiss any feedback that doesn't align with your vision.
Right. I can see how that happens. You've poured your heart and soul into this idea, and then someone comes along and tells you it needs to change.
Yeah.
That's got to be tough.
It can be, but remember, the lean startup is all about being data-driven.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to let go of your ego and let the market kind of guide you.
Right.
Sometimes what you think is a brilliant feature might not resonate with your target audience at all.
So it's about listening to what the market wants, not just what you think they want.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the final mistake on our list?
Scaling too quickly.
Okay.
Expanding before you've achieved what we call product market fit can be a fatal mistake.
Right.
It's like trying to run before you can walk.
So you're saying even if you have some initial success with your MVP, you need to be cautious about scaling up too fast.
Exactly. The lean startup approach encourages sustainable growth.
Right.
Make sure your product or service is truly resonating with your target market and solving a real problem before you start thinking about global domination.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the pitfalls, but let's dive into some examples of companies that have used these principles to achieve, massive success.
Sure.
And I think Amazon's journey is a perfect illustration of how powerful the lean startup approach can be.
Absolutely. Think back to Amazon's early days. They started as an online bookstore, which at the time was a pretty novel idea, but they didn't just stop there. They paid really close attention to what their customers wanted.
Right.
And they were constantly experimenting and expanding their offerings based on that feedback.
I look at them now.
I know.
They're a global behemoth, selling everything from books to groceries to cloud computing services. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it really shows the power of starting small, validating your assumptions, and iterating based on real data. Another great example is Uber. They didn't try to launch in every city around the world all at once.
Right.
They started with a very basic app, offering rides in a limited area of San Francisco.
Right. They focused on nailing their model in one market before expanding to other cities.
Exactly. That initial limited launch allowed them to gather valuable feedback,
Yeah.
refine their operations, and test their pricing strategy before they scaled up. And let's not forget about Zappos,
Oh, yeah.
the online shoe retailer.
Okay.
They took a really innovative approach to testing demand in the early days.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did Zappos do?
Well, the founder, Nick Swinmurn, had this hypothesis that people would be willing to buy shoes online.
Okay.
But instead of investing in a huge inventory and building this complex e-commerce platform,
Right.
he started by taking photos of shoes at local stores and posting them on his website.
Wow.
When someone placed an order, he would go buy the shoes from the store and ship them to the customer.
Wait, so he didn't even have any inventory?
No.
He was basically acting as a middleman between the customer and the local shoe store.
That's right.
That's genius.
It was a brilliant way to test his assumption with minimal risk.
Yeah.
He was able to validate the demand for online shoe sales before investing heavily in inventory or infrastructure.
That's amazing how these companies who are now, giants in their industries started with such humble beginnings. It really shows that anyone can apply these principles no matter how big or small their idea is.
And that's the key takeaway here. You don't need a groundbreaking, world-changing idea to succeed.
Right.
You just need a willingness to test your assumptions, learn from your mistakes, and be open to adapting.
Right.
That's the beauty of the lean startup approach.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see how these companies, who we see now as these unstoppable forces, started with such a scrappy experimental approach. They weren't afraid to just get their hands dirty and figure things out as they went along.
Right, and that's what makes the lean startup so powerful. It's not about having all the answers up front. It's about having the framework to ask the right questions and test your assumptions quickly and efficiently.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the lean startup, let's recap the key takeaways for our listeners, who are ready to put these principles into action.
All right, so let's distill it down to the essentials.
Okay.
First and foremost, start small.
Yeah.
Don't get bogged down trying to create the perfect product right out of the gate. Build that minimum viable product, get it in front of real people, and just see what happens.
Right. Focus on testing your core assumptions, not on bells and whistles. What's next?
Next, and this is crucial, listen to your customers. Their feedback is invaluable, Don't let your ego or your preconceived notions cloud your judgment.
Yeah.
Let the data guide your decisions.
It's all about being data-driven and responding to what the market is telling you. What else should our listeners keep in mind?
Be ready to pivot.
Okay.
If something's not working, don't be afraid to change course. Remember Instagram's journey. They started as a check-in app and ended up as this global photo-sharing phenomenon. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come when you're willing to shift gears.
It's about being flexible and adapting to new information. I love that. And what's our final takeaway for aspiring entrepreneurs?
Fail fast, learn fast.
Yeah,
The beauty of the lean startup approach is it encourages rapid experimentation.
right.
The more quickly you can test your assumptions and iterate, the faster you'll find that path to success.
So true. Embrace those early failures as valuable learning opportunities. The lean startup is packed with so much wisdom and practical advice for anyone looking to build a successful business.
It really is, and as you go forth and apply these principles, I want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
What's one assumption about your idea that you could test right now using a simple MVP?
That's such a great question. It's time to stop theorizing and start experimenting. Get out there, build something, test it, learn it, iterate. You might just surprise yourself with what you can achieve. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep learning.